The President of the United States hid in a catering trailer so he could be put on a different plane to be flown out of an allied country last month. It's one of the craziest political stories we've had in a while, for a lot of reasons, not just the fact that it sounds like something they'd cook up for one of the worst Ocean's 11 sequels. It also is just the latest story in a weekend filled with new blunders in the Iran war that Trump might be trying to do anything he can to get out of, including giving up the one thing he said we were there to do. And then the White House put out a new vaccine recommendation schedule for kids, and doctors and scientists are sick over it. See what I did there? Yeah. It's Tuesday, August 11th, 2026. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Hermes. Okay, so this first story broke in the New York Times, and then it was backed up by multiple other places, and it's just one of the wildest presidential stories we've had in a while. And I don't mean just from Trump, but just in terms of presidential history. So, according to sources within the White House, during his trip to Turkey last month for the NATO summit, the one with all our major European allies, Trump took his new Air Force One to get there. Now, this was a little sketchy because it was pretty well known that the new Air Force One wasn't really ready for a presidential flight yet, and certainly not one to a country that shares a border with Iran. In case you don't remember, because all of these things can kind of be hard to keep track of, Trump's new Air Force One is a flying palace that was a gift from the Qatari government, definitely not a bribe in any way. A gift, by the way, the president will be taking with him after he leaves office so it can sit in his presidential museum, and he definitely won't be flying around on it after he leaves office. And there were a lot of issues with making this luxury superjet into a functioning Air Force One, mostly things like maneuvering capabilities and defense systems, like, drone and missile detection. There were also worries the plane might have been bugged with surveillance tech so the Qataris could spy on the president or the people he hosts on his plane from time to time, say the Prime Minister of Israel, because Qatar has a history of supporting groups like Hamas. What this meant was the plane needed to be almost entirely disassembled, inspected, and then retrofitted. It was going to be expensive, and it was going to take some time, potentially more time than Trump was going to have in office. So instead, Trump had the Pentagon and the Secret Service rush through the job so he could unveil the new plane right around the 4th of July, doing away with the iconic Kennedy paint job in place of his own Trump brand colors. And as a side note here, I'm starting to think that Trump has this love-hate thing with JFK. I don't know if it's because he was a contemporary of JFK Jr.'s in New York, or if he never had the Kennedy looks and he's upset about that, or if he thinks he should be seen as a president like Kennedy and no one else sees him that way, or what. But the man has spent a lot of time in this presidency undoing some specific Kennedy things, from the Voting Rights Act to the Kennedy Center to the Rose Garden, and I don't know, I feel like a psychologist would have a field day with that. Anyway, Trump takes the new plane that he knows is unsafe to Turkey for the NATO summit. He lands, does the summit. On the way home, Trump says they'll be taking the old Air Force One back for, quote, old time's sake, which is dumb and weird. And, well, it turns out the White House had gotten word there was an active assassination threat from Iran on the president's plane. Not a specific plane, just whatever plane he would be on. It was loose and undefined, but worrying, so they wanted Trump to switch back to the plane that, had actual defenses. That was the story we were told until now, because what we learned this week is that isn't what happened. If you're watching this episode, this is a video put out by the Washington Post that goes through this in some pretty good detail. So Trump boards the old Air Force One, and he didn't stay there. He went off the other side of the plane and hid in a catering cart along with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth that was then loaded onto a flatbed truck driven to a different jet that didn't use the Air Force One call sign, which is what the designation is when a president is on board any plane. Then that plane flew to a joint airbase in the UK where Trump was snuck back onto the old Air Force One. How, we don't know, but again, he was hidden, and then came out of the old Air Force One as if he'd been on it the entire time. So let's talk about the implications of this, because there are more than just a few. First, the threat here was credible enough that the Secret Service didn't think Trump should even board the fully equipped Air Force One, which raises real concerns about why Trump would have been allowed or advised to go to this NATO summit in Turkey at all, given that it's Iran's neighbor. A high threat level from Iran would be like the first thing that anyone would think of. He bragged about being at the top of Iran's assassination list at this summit and before. So the vice president could have just gone and it would have been fine, really. Second, almost none of Trump's staff were told except a select few, and none of the White House press corps that travels with the president were told that Trump was not on board that Air Force One. I guess it's not Air Force One, just this plane they were on, because the threat was so high, meaning a decision was made to put their lives in potential danger. And that's not the same thing as the possibility of Air Force One being a target at all times. This was a threat apparently so credible that Trump couldn't be on that plane, and they were fine with letting other people, their staff and civilians, board that plane. Not to mention that the press that travels with the president are the eyes and ears of the American public while Trump goes abroad. God forbid something happens to the real jet the president was on. How would we know who was running the country when that happens? What happened if something happened to Trump, an 80-year-old man with chronic blood flow problems at 30,000 feet? Third, the image of the American president hiding away in a catering cart next to mini cans of Diet Coke is the opposite of an image of Trump as the fight, fight, fight president. He literally hid himself away from the fight. Now, don't get me wrong. Presidents in the past have done the old switcheroo. Famously, Bill Clinton did it on a trip to Pakistan in 2000, but the press was told about it. Clinton didn't pretend like he'd been on Air Force One. He landed in the other jet and then stepped off that one in a show of, we pulled one over on you. And he didn't hide himself next to the Biscoff cookies and the in-flight headphones. The kicker on this, too, is that it explains so much of why Trump exploded at the initial stories about why he had to switch planes. The New York Times reporters who first reported that it was because of the new Qatari plane not being ready and not safe enough were investigated by the DOJ and had their phone records subpoenaed so the DOJ could track down their sources, something that is truly antithetical to the First Amendment. The reaction from the White House at that time just really didn't fit the story unless you know the part that we're getting now. So far, Trump hasn't said anything about this, at least not as I'm recording, and that story has taken some of the focus off the fact that this weekend, the war in Iran has gotten further and further away from the White House's grasp, as Iran said that the Strait of Hermes would stay closed until 2029, when Donald Trump was out of office, unless the U.S. agreed to all of their demands, which includes removing U.S. forces from the Middle East entirely and giving over $300 billion in reparations for damages caused by the war. That, by the way, is double what was spent to rebuild all of Europe after World War II. Now, Trump fired back on Truth Social that actually the U.S. is the one that needs reparations from Iran for bombings and proxy attacks going back 50 years in a very I know you are, but what am I response, right? But behind the scenes, the president is at a loss for what to do and knows the war is sinking his support here at home, especially ahead of the midterms. He told Axios he's only, quote, semi-negotiating with Iran at this point, saying he's low-keying it with them, which whatever that means, because they're out of money, which may or may not be true. But also, Iran's not exactly a country that's unwilling to make its people suffer to prop up its aims. So things would have to get a lot worse there for that to matter to them. But then he said, it'll work out. It always works out. It's like a chess game. Which isn't how chess works at all. The Wall Street Journal also reported for it to all work out, Trump is considering dropping the one thing that he said was the reason for this entire war, which was stopping Iran from having a nuclear weapon. He floated to staff as recently as last week that he's willing to walk away from the war without a nuclear deal. Partially because he wants to find a way to get the Strait open before the midterms, but also because he doesn't think Iran can rebuild its nuclear program after the attacks on 3 major sites last year, despite the fact that satellite images have shown significant rebuilding already taking place. And it's things like that that led Vice President J.D. Vance to say not that Donald Trump won the war like Trump posted over the weekend, but that we are still in the middle of the game. And it has foreign policy experts now comparing Donald Trump to presidents like Jimmy Carter and his Iran crisis, Herbert Hoover and his economy, and Richard Nixon's paranoia. One foreign policy expert this week at the Council on Foreign Relations said the Iran war has replaced Trump's art of the deal with the art of concealing defeat, which I think is a pretty good phrase that sums up where things are at with the war and why this story about him concealing himself away off of Air Force One feels less like a James Bond mission and more of like a retreat. Okay, let's take a quick break, and when we come back, a new vaccine schedule and recommendations from the White House that seem to come out of nowhere. I've found something that I need to stay sane in all this chaos is going to the gym. I go to the Kronk gym here in Detroit. If you're into boxing, that might mean something to you. If not, it's really just an excuse to hit something. And, to get a workout in. But I also like to drink a protein shake afterwards to make sure that I'm staying healthy. I have spent years suffering through the worst kinds of protein shakes. Chalky, thick, it's like drinking wet cement. It's just awful. It's honestly worse than the workout. It's why I recently switched to Clear Protein. That's clear with a K. It's a clear whey protein. They've got two great flavors right now, strawberry watermelon and wild blue raspberry. This stuff tastes like a juice drink instead of a milkshake gone wrong, you know what I mean? And it's not skimping to get there either. 20 grams of protein, no sugar, no lactose, so no bloat and no tummy troubles if that's a problem for you and you already know that's a deal breaker. If this sounds like something that you want after your workout, you can get your hands on a 20% off code right now. You can use MIMS25 at checkout. And full disclosure, I do get a cut of this commission, but you'll be helping out the show too and getting some great tasting protein for after your workout. Again, that's Clear Protein with a K. Use MIMS25 at checkout because drinking your protein shake shouldn't be the hardest part of your workout. All right, let's get back to the show. Almost out of nowhere yesterday, the president signed a major executive order where he signed off on a new set of vaccine recommendations and schedules that lowered the number of vaccines kids need to get, including no longer recommending that kids through age 18 get vaccinated for things like hepatitis A and B, the flu, meningitis, RSV, and of course, COVID. He wants to spread those vaccines they do want kids to get across more doctor's visits, and they want to split up the MMR vaccine, which is the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, into 3 separate shots, which pharmaceutical companies don't do, haven't done in decades, and aren't even licensed to do in the U.S. right now. The reasons they want to do this is, in the words of the President and Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., is to lower the number of vaccines kids get from either 72 or 84 or 94, depending on the time you tuned into this press conference, down to 11, right around where we had it in the mid-1980s to 1990s. Here's how Trump put it.
At 1 year, you should have 5 separate visits for vaccines rather than getting them all in the same day. And I saw this early on, and I've seen proof of it, where they have a vaccination thing, looks like the size of a bottle of soda, poured into a little child's body. And bad things happen in many cases, in too many cases, because this is an explosion. This is an epidemic.
Yeah, that's just not how that works at all. It's also worth mentioning before I go on, this was a bizarre press conference. Trump fell asleep a number of times. The woman behind Trump, who was apparently a conservative influencer, could not stand still to a distracting degree. RFK Jr. was shaking really badly, and I know he has a medical condition that causes his voice to shake, but it doesn't affect his body, and he was really shaking. Also, the HHS people are on this diet right now of like sauerkraut and steak only for reasons I don't understand. So, it just smelled wild in there. Anyway, the White House also put up this scary image everywhere of a European baby on the left smiling with just 11 syringes around them compared to an unhappy American baby surrounded by needles like a victim in a Saw movie on the right. That's just not the reality, because for the White House to get those incredibly high vaccine numbers, whether it's 72, 84, or 94, they'd have to include every single booster shot of every single vaccine until a kid is 18 years old, so it's not given to babies. But the White House wants you to think that. They also want you to think that by being given too many vaccines at once, little bodies are being flooded with too many what are called antigens, the things that make vaccines vaccines. Sometimes dormant or dead strains of a virus or even just pieces of their genetic makeup that your immune system uses like a wanted poster for the real thing so it knows what it looks like if you ever catch the disease. But it's also not really what RFK Jr. cares about because this antigen overload is part of an old and new run at the vaccines cause autism lie that has never been proven or backed up. The guy who wrote the original article in the 90s was proven false dozens of times over for decades now, and the original study was eventually retracted for inaccuracy. The CDC's own website, despite being changed to say that vaccines don't cause autism, isn't an evidence-based statement, has evidence proving the statement is true. I am more and more on the side of what voter fraud conspiracies are to politics is what this conspiracy is to health. It just won't go away. The thing is, most medical experts believe this new vaccine schedule is both wildly unnecessary and potentially dangerous. It used to be in the 1980s that the antigen load of all the vaccines a kid would get was more than 3,200. Mostly coming from the whooping cough vaccine, according to a Stanford doctor named Jake Scott, who wrote about this in Stat News. But back then, we were only vaccinating against 7 diseases. Today, we vaccinate for around 16 to 18 diseases, and the antigen load is 165. Not 165,000, 165. A 95% drop in antigens being put into kids' bodies. Because we're better at making vaccines now, so we don't need as much of the antigen to do the job. Not to mention, a landmark study from 2002 found that an infant's body could theoretically handle about 10,000 simultaneous vaccines before 1% of their immune system cells were used up. Now, obviously that's extreme, but the point is there is no danger of immune system overload. But it could be potentially really dangerous to spread these vaccinations out. Not vaccinating for certain diseases anymore and breaking up vaccines into more shots means more kids are going to get fewer vaccines, which might be the ultimate goal. The worry among doctors and public health officials is, up until yesterday, it was easy to get all these shots taken care of in a few doctor's visits. But the more time parents have to take off work to go to another appointment for their child, the less appointments their kids are likely going to make because people just don't get that much time off work. And that means there are going to be more unvaccinated kids, and that means more kids get sick more often and get sick with dangerous diseases. Part of the reason the MMR vaccine isn't 3 vaccines is for this exact reason, to take care of these 3 incredibly dangerous childhood vaccines all at once. Diseases that we are seeing a resurgence of right now. Measles cases are higher than we've seen them in 35 years, and an outbreak that a researcher at the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy said just last week was a runaway train. The CDC still recommends the combined MMR vaccine as the best way to protect kids from all 3 diseases on its website right now. The real thing about these executive orders, too, is they're only recommendations that states and individual doctors don't even have to follow. Many of them haven't been following the other recommendations HHS tried to put in place last year for a lot of the same quote-unquote health safety reasons. It's also not even clear right now if pharmaceutical companies and vaccine makers would follow some of these things either, because it would cost them a lot of money to overhaul a vaccine like MMR that's in production for decades. Overall, the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Osteopathy Association, the American Dental Association, and dozens of other national and international groups, both public and private health groups, still say the vaccines and schedule we had prior to this and this administration were safe and effective and should still be followed. And if you're at all worried, talk to your own doctor or a doctor you trust to make the best decision for you, but they'll likely tell you the same thing. Okay, that is it for today's episode. Please rate and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. Become a paid subscriber to the Make It Make Sense Substack. You have just 9 days left to get in on that founding price of $5 a month or $50 a year until the price goes up on August 20th. This is your last and final push here in this final week. Paid subscribers this week get access to an updated version of the article about why Congress and the Senate get so much time off. This year alone, they've only worked 88 days in the Senate and 58 days in the House out of 221 days so far this year, and they're on break again for another 5 weeks. That is this week's Things You Forgot from Civics class, and it's only available to paid subscribers. Again, you can get in on that for just $5 a month or $50 a year until August 20th. And as always, share the show on social media. You can tag me at Grant Hermes on Twitter, Blue Sky, and the Say So News app, and at Grant_Hermes on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Hermes, and I'll talk to you next time.